I don't know, man. I feel like that's just like maybe the Chinese, also like the immigrant way. It's just like, hey, grind and you shall receive.
Mhm.
So I finally found out because of like some email headings of like who the subcontractor was. I found out where the yard was that they actually have their location. And
Mhm.
one day I'm just like, this is crazy. It's been 3.5, 4 weeks. I'm driving there, and no matter what, I'm gonna get those and get it done. So I took my car in a big, like you imagine a big yard with like 10, 20 trucks. And I parked my car right in front of the entrance.
Mhm.
And I said, guys, if you don't give me my boba, like you can imagine like a little Asian dude, right? Like I'm walking up these big guys. They're like, and I'm like, hey, if you don't get me, like find me where this box is, I'm not gonna move my car. And so as soon as I said that, the guy's like, wait,
So what's up, everybody? This is the Chris and Glenn Info or CGI Podcast. I'm your host, Chris.
And I'm your host, Glenn.
We're two friends who enjoy having interesting conversations about interesting topics with interesting people. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Charles Chen.
what's up, guys?
Awesome. Nice to have you here, Charles. So, a little background on Charles. Charles was born in Guangzhou, China, and he moved to Northern California, Silicon Valley, at the age of 8. He grew up in a trilingual family speaking English, Mandarin, and Cantonese. He then went to complete his high school degree at Cupertino High School and UC Davis, where he graduated Magna Cum Laude and was founder and president of the Finance and Investment Club there. He's also has a master's of science in finance from the Imperial College of London. And his work has taken him to many places, including working as a data and mining machine learning analyst in Tokyo, Japan, managing multi-million-dollar debt investments at several firms in Northern California, developing products at Zynga as a senior product manager, leading as senior director of growth, marketing, and operations at StockX, quenching boba-thirsts at Kuma Boba in Detroit, and now serving as head of product at a startup called Practice. And on a side note, I also like to congratulate you on becoming a father to a healthy and beautiful boy.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yep,
Right.
and thank
So,
you for joining
I
us.
mean, thank you for joining us. One of the things that stood out to Chris and I in your professional experience is the fact that you started and founded your own boba shop in Detroit. So I wanted to start from there and just kind of ask you, because I read your blog for your website. It's called From Zero to One, Building a Boba Shop is Hard. And you mentioned that you and your wife started your own boba shop because of there's not a lot of there's no product available for you there. Like nobody has boba shops in Detroit, and you grew up with that kind of experience in the Bay Area, so you wanted to start your own. But you decided that on kind of a whim. You quote, consume too many plates of bulgogi, drinking too many glasses of wine, and watching too many episodes of Crazy Rich Asians and Kim's Convenience reruns. So can you elaborate on how this whole conception started?
Dude, I mean, thinking back, so yeah, we moved to Detroit. This was like early or mid 2017. There were no boba spots. It was always attached to like Thai restaurants. And so every time you get a drink, it would be like really hard balls, pun, no, right? Like it's just pretty poor product. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then they opened a Kung Fu Tea. And so every day we go, we're like, this is like pretty mediocre product, but it would be lined out the door. And so I would
Mm.
just sit in there and be like, hey, like the guy who's running it, props to him. Great, he's killing it, but he doesn't even speak English. Like the culture wasn't great in terms of like just setting up like it wasn't a hangout spot. It was clearly like come in, we're doing this for the money. Like the customer service was poor. And I'm just thinking back, like, okay, this is clearly like a mediocre to subpar experience. But every day the line was out the door. From a business
Mm.
perspective, I would literally sit in there and just count people. Like, hey, every hour there's like 25 people here. And if they had the production capacity, they could probably do 40. And I just picked different hours throughout the week. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is killing. And at the time at StockX, which we'll get into, I was in a little bit of a lull. I kind of started as a the first product guy, really took product to the product team to a certain level. A lot of regime changes, like new management, like getting our grown-up managers. So I was kind of transitioning out of product and they needed help in the marketing. I'm like, well, what does that really mean? So I really wanted like to tickle my like get shit done mentality. So I'm like, okay, well, there's business opportunity here. I know some friends that are running boba shops. They're not doing it that well. Why can't I do it? Right. Like, and I think we'll get into this. It's that I vastly underestimated how hard these types of like manual jobs are. I think I'm just stuck in the whole software world where everything, it's much more about like discovery, exploration. You're doing a lot more things with your brain here. And we'll get into it. Like, dude, you're constantly just busy. Like, you can't even have time to think. You're always just doing, doing, doing. It's just a whole different vibe, but great experience. My wife and I, like, we got to do a bunch of like design work. She's very into design, both from like digital and interior design perspective. So we did a ton there. It was awesome. But at the same time, it was a grind. So
I can
I'll lead
imagine.
off with that. Not much money was made. Like relatively speaking, it was a grind, but it was somewhat fun.
That's really cool. So you saw an opportunity, you saw a demand, and then you kind of took the leap of faith and just decided to do it. I think that's really cool.
Dude, one funny note though, right? Like, I think I saw it and everyone else saw it because by the time our store opened, six more popped up within the 5 mile radius.
Ooh.
Oh, wow.
Ours also got delayed because right around that time we got our $1 billion valuation. And it was like, oh, Charles, all hands on deck. Like, you don't have that much free time. We have to grow, grow, grow. So then I'm like, okay, well, now who's going to manage this contractor? So I didn't push that hard. I'm just like, oh, every weekend, can we just take a look at how much progress you're making? And if you don't push them, they're not going to push themselves, which is I actually ended up having to hire someone to watch this contractor, which is another funny story. But yeah, so we were delayed a few months, but by the time we opened, man, 5 or 6 popped up within the 5 mile radius. So the competition really heated up.
Gotcha.
Wow. I mean, you had opportunity to step away from it even early on, right? So what made you want to continue pursuing it? Was it just not being aware of just how much extra work that'll be once you got it started, or like what made you push through despite all the things that were happening in your life?
I think there's a lot of sunk costs that I couldn't let go, to be completely honest. Like I was just totally oblivious, I think, which I think once you learn more as you get older, it's really hard to start things because you're just much more, you just have more foresight into like, oh man, this is going to be really hard. So let's just not do it. But at the time, I'm like, hey, I've signed a few contracts with like Amazon, right? Like I have some like CRM vendors. It was pretty easy to get going, to negotiate, to get out of. What's the big deal? Well, once you sign a physical lease, you're personally on the hook for like, I don't know, $250,000. So yeah, you could not choose to walk away, but you're gonna be on the hook for a lot of money there.
Gotcha. So
So I would say
there was a level of commitment that kind of kept you tied down, and you just kind of decided, hey, why not go all in and see where this goes?
exactly. And there were moments of fun. Like my wife and I were designing the logo, for example. And my wife's she's your typical designer almost. I think if she didn't become a doctor, she would have been an excellent designer. She would be like, hey, I'm kind of thinking of like this theme, like Chinese calligraphy, but like more modern. I'm like, okay. And I sketch something out. Think about this? No. Okay, what don't you like about it? I don't know. I just hate it. And we would just get into this iteration where I'm like just guessing at what she means. But the thing is, once I kind of get it right, her taste is almost like it always hits. So, but yeah, there were fun parts like that, right? Like you make the logo, you make the design, and people are like, oh my gosh, it's beautiful. You get the glass jars, which we served our drinks in a glass jar, and you see people holding it. and you're like, oh man, they love it. Like our lines were out the door. We got it to a point we sold like over 100,000 drinks in the time when I was there, and you were starting to see our jars pop up everywhere. Like people find it,
Wow.
like, hey, I found your jar in our company fridge, or like, hey, I found your jar in the thrift store selling for like $1. Like it just started popping up everywhere in the neighborhood. So like there's moments that like also motivate you, but yeah, I think the personal financial hook too also kind of pushed us to keep going.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean,
Very cool. Very
it
cool.
sounds like you speak pretty fondly of the experience. But even now with me and Glenn, it's funny. You mentioned we both get feedback from our significant others when we design like thumbnails or things like that. We try to get the female perspective. Sometimes it's wiser.
Do you guys get the same response? The feedback
Uh,
that I
I think for the most part similar.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
an iterative process. Yeah, I mean, you're never gonna get it right the first time, but with with more eyes on it, you'll get to a better consensus. I mean, another thing about boba shops, like, have you made boba before? Like, you don't like, how did you even come up with the recipes, and how do you know how to make something that tastes good? Or like, were you doing it in your free time? Tell me about how you come up with those boba recipes.
So not only have I never made boba, I haven't even worked like a retail job in my life. Like it's so yeah, vastly underestimated how hard it was. But I actually had a friend who I met at Zynga who had a good friend of his has a chain of boba stores down in SoCal. They're actually called Boba Bear. I don't know, Chris, if you've seen them.
Oh,
But
maybe.
like they do like hookah or like shisha and boba,
Mhm.
so it's much more like the night alcoholic kind of smoker crowd. Um, but we actually spoke to a bunch of like boba shops, but he was a good friend of my friend who, when we tried his stuff, we're like, it's actually not bad. And because we were kind of like friend of friends, he's like, tell you what, I don't usually do this, but I'll let you white label our brand. You can take our initial recipes, give us a rev share, and yeah, like we started there. So we had like an
Ah,
initial list of products that we know we liked, and then after that my wife like just went ham on like creating products. So like she developed this Hong Kong milk tea, like the condensed milk, very
mhm.
heavy black tea. And then we just added like a lot of different variations, but we did have a baseline to work with.
Gotcha.
wow, no,
Cool.
that's incredible. So it sounded
So
like this was overall like a really great thing that, you know, bolstered your relationship with your wife as well, since it was something that you guys had a lot of fun doing. You got to spend a lot of extra time doing together.
Yes, I think, but it also broke us, man. Like
Oh no.
it actually, I think, accelerated our curve of like just understanding ourselves, because like at least up to that point in my life, I'm like, I can just power through anything. Like for her too, right? Like she's like, oh, you need me to work 80-hour weeks for 4 years? Don't worry, I got it, right? With her residency. Like for her whole
Jeez.
life has been a grind. And for me, I'm like, yeah, like I'm used to this life. I grind. But I'll tell you what, like when we get those jars, which we get them made in China, and the only way you get it like profitable is you have to order so many. So we
mhm.
would literally get a container. Like I don't know if you've seen these big trucks that haul like a big container. We would order that every time. So when that container comes, there's like 4,000 boxes of jars. Each one's 30 pounds.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I got this. Because there's no people at like Home Depot you can hire to help you unload. So I'm like, oh man, I guess I'll just have to do it. I threw out my shoulder. It was the first time I got hurt. It took 4.5 hours. I
Oh
found
my
two
God.
guys on the street. It was like the three of us and like a bunch of girls that worked at the store. Just like boom, boom, boom. Took 4.5 hours nonstop. And like moments like those just like break you, like so yeah, I think overall, very good learning experience, but like mentally and physically, I think back and I'm like exhausted again. Like it's exhausting.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
exhausting.
No, I mean I have mad respect for business owners, people who, go off and start their own businesses, especially if it's retail related. Um, my fiance is a pharmacist, and it's quote unquote retail. She always describes the physical aspect of it. They're working nonstop. It's not like, me working in front of a computer. I can take a break and grab a coffee, make some food, go to the lunchroom, walk down the street to get Starbucks. Yeah, it's mad respect to retail workers and also mad respect to business owners because I feel like every story I've heard, they're never working just 40-hour weeks. The business is run on their shoulders. And of course, they take it upon themselves to work even harder to make sure it succeeds. Because I feel like there's an added level of pressure that if your business doesn't succeed, your employees, they could be jobless, and I can only imagine just like all the stresses involved with that.
For sure. Dude, I'll give you guys one last funny story. Like, I don't know if you understand like how trucking works, or like the supply chain just within yeah, as it relates to trucks and how they work. But I found out the hard way, right? So I used to want to do like just in time inventory because I don't want to hold too much cash or front too much cash. So I would order boba based on some calculations. I'm like, okay, it will get here in like 7 days. My lead time needs to be like 9 at most. But what I didn't realize was if I get someone to deliver the boxes of boba or like just long way freight, they actually then subcontract it out to like truckers who are just like individuals like you or I who own a truck. So like they post a job and it's like, hey, I'll take it, right? So one time it was like 3 weeks, we still didn't get our boba. And I would call the contractor and they're like, oh, it's not here yet. And then I would say, well, what do you mean? It's been 3 weeks. It's supposed to take 7 days. I don't know. Let me call the guy who's actually driving. And it would just keep getting dragged on. And we are out of boba. So my general manager's like, dude, I'm getting yelled at by customers every day. And finally, I was like, okay, who is the subcontractor? I'm going to call them. And guess what? They don't pick up the phone, right? Because they're like just on the road, probably. So I finally found out because of like some email headings of like who the subcontractor was. I found out where the yard was that they actually have their location. And one day I'm just like, this is crazy. It's been 3.5, 4 weeks. I'm driving there, and no matter what, I'm gonna get those and get it done. So I took my car in a big, like you imagine a big yard with like 10, 20 trucks. And I parked my car right in front of the entrance. And I said, guys, if you don't give me my boba, like you can imagine like a little Asian dude, right? Like I'm walking up these big guys. They're like, and I'm like, hey, if you don't get me, like find me where this box is, I'm not gonna move my car. And so as soon as I said that, the guy's like, wait, who are you? And I'm like, yeah, I'm this guy, I'm looking for this. And they're like, dude, this has been here for like 2 weeks. We've been trying to get someone to pick it up, but the person who we're interacting with told us like they couldn't get a hold of you. And I'm like, well, what? But I was ready to go, right? Like I was ready to go, and ended up just being like, hey, we're even helping load it onto your SUV. But it's moments like that where it's like, yeah,
Wow.
you don't get that behind a computer,
And
Man,
you already paid for it and everything, right? Like you paid for the
Exactly.
service, and wow. Yeah. Well, as I could listen to this all day. I don't want this to be the Boba Show exclusively, but I guess Glenn, did you want to kick off some additional questions about Charles's background?
I mean, I feel like that's such an epitome of, you know, your whole career, someone that grinds. So let's take it back to where it all started. I mean, is this something that you were from the beginning, like in high school? I know we've talked a little bit about this, but yeah, share with us about, how you developed this mindset. Who were you in high school and how did you get to, you know, yeah, take us on that journey from high school.
I don't know, man. I feel like that's just like maybe the Chinese, also like the immigrant way. It's just like, hey, grind and you shall receive, right? Like I still remember my dad had this saying. He was like, what it was like, there's gold bricks or something inside of a book. But it's like, yeah, like inside a book, there's like gold, right? Meaning like, hey, just like study or like grind it out and you'll get that. But for a long time, it was true, right? Like anytime it was related to sports or tests or classes, I knew whenever I would grind, I usually get rewarded. It's actually an interesting thing because like I don't know how you guys were during the pandemic, but I would say the last 2, 3 years, I got into a really weird space in my head where like the world didn't quite make sense anymore, right? Like you had Trump, you had like the Brexit event happening, a lot of things that seem like, hey, the big loud guy that doesn't have to do much seems to be winning, right? Like SAT scores were getting removed from admission processes, like fairness of outcome rather than fairness of like opportunity was like being pushed. And like my whole world, I'm just like, dude, this doesn't make sense. Like, what is going on with the world? This is kind of a tangent, but like, I think we actually like 2022 was great because it kind of normalized. It was like, hey, the world didn't change. It was just one side's getting pushed way harder than the other, but now things are normalizing. But routing back to the grind mindset, right? Like that was always my thing. Like, hey, if you want something, go get it. If you don't get it, don't blame it on someone else, right? It's up to you, go get it. So I think long-winded way of saying that, I think it's the Chinese culture. Maybe it's just like, maybe it's a sports thing, but overall, that's always been like the mentality I think is important to have is, grind and control what you can.
Yeah, no, I think I can definitely relate to that. I think having discipline is important. Um, and speaking from somebody who also was raised from a Chinese family with a Chinese mindset, education was really important. There was an emphasis on education. And what was kind of interesting for me is growing up, there was kind of this duality between like Eastern culture and Western culture. And the Chinese mentality was always, hey, get good grades, you got to get straight A's, whatever. And Glenn and I have talked about this at length. And whereas the Western culture was a little different. It was kind of like pursue your interests, right? Like go find your passion, find your interests, and that will drive the rest of your career or whatever. And I almost try to find the best way to merge both. That like my type of upbringing, forcing myself to get good grades. I think that personally, I think that causes people to despise their work, to kind of see it as tedious, right? Kind of they have to force themselves to do this. But one advantage to it is it builds up the discipline. And I feel like if you kind of apply that discipline to something that you're interested in, something that you're passionate in, I think what's not done enough in the Eastern culture is cultivating this idea of hey, do something that really interests you, that really inspires you, and that's something that I kind of take to heart. So despite like having a PhD and all that, like I'm not a fantastic student, but what I really like is I really like engineering. I really like building products. I really like doing that kind of stuff, and I feel like that has driven me to go through that grind. So like, yeah. So very interesting that you talk about. I think a little bit is cultural, a little bit is kind of environmental, and like I think discipline is important, and I think like having that passion, that motivation is also important as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very interesting. Like, did you have this at a really early age then? Like this that kind of lesson instilled in you, or did you have to develop that over time? And were there struggles in how you got to this level of just like tolerance for such harsh grinding kind of experiences?
Dude, actually, I feel like I'm pretty soft. Like if you compare me to my wife, she can seriously like not sleep for days and just keep working. And she's like, oh, that's just expected of me. Whereas I'm like, I can't do that. Um, but I think Glenn and I play a lot of basketball, and Chris, he'll let you know I'm pretty competitive. I actually think it kind of came from that. It was like, hey, I really want to win. So therefore I'm willing to like do whatever it takes to win. And that's when you kind of gravitates for like towards like the Kobe Bryant, right? Of like the Mamba mentality of like just working harder than everyone else. I think that's how you kind of get into it. And then as you kind of get success from what you think is you working harder than other people, it kind of reinforces you to do it. Um, I think Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm overselling my grinding though, because I'm not, I'm pretty soft unless it's like things I really care about. Um, but I think the one other thing about, Eastern culture is, at least for me, we're always taught to be respect your elders, right? Like don't try to be humble, like don't speak out too much. In fact, speaking too much is often seen as like, oh, it kind of conveys that someone's dumb. Like growing up, those were the themes that I would hear, right? So what we end up with is I see a lot of my colleagues or folks that are on my team or even on kind of like peripheral teams, they just kind of put their head down. They work really hard. They don't ever really like to like present what they're doing or show what they're learning or speak up when something is clearly not right or something that they've seen opposites of. And one thing I do like about current culture, Kanye had a good quote. Don't agree with everything he's saying, but he had a saying of closed mouths don't get fed, right? So if you don't speak up, if people don't know what you're doing, they're not going to understand that. So I think there's another part outside of like working hard is like, will you actually speak up? Will you show your work? How bold are you to kind of just like be out there? It goes a little bit counter to how we're brought up, but I think that's a huge piece to drive not just like career success, but really any type of success.
Mm-hmm.
Is your ability to overcome speaking, like the fear of speaking up.
Right. Yeah. Communication, I think is important as you mentioned there. Um, so I guess let's talk a little bit about your interest in finance. How did that get started, and and how did you get your career started essentially?
Dude, I'm gonna keep it 100. Like most of, so again, like I feel like now I have a baby boy now. If he's going through the same thought process as I did 18 years from now, I'll be like, dude, you gotta get a little deeper than that. But anyway, I went in as pre-med because I'm like, hey, that seems like the cool Asian thing to do since I have no idea what I want. But pretty quickly, I'm like, I can't keep up. Like you have to study so hard for like OChem and just like chemistry, even just basic chemistry itself. We had like the hour-long labs and like all this coursework. I'm like, dude, I can't. And I have to have like a 3.7 GPA just to be competitive. I don't know, man. I don't know if it's cut out for me. So then I kind of like just thought about, okay, now you're getting older. There's no more like, hey, wait till next year, then I'll start grinding or start trying academically. Like your runway is getting pretty low. I got to pick something. So I thought, okay, what do I think would pay me well? Like, what do people seem prestigious? Like, really, just like, what's the word? Like not good, like just surface level stuff, right? Like, oh, what's prestigious? What pays well? So at the time, it was like either law or like finance. Okay, what about finance? Oh, well, like this thing called investment banking, like M&A, will open all the doors to like private equity, hedge funds. Your life will be like just, you know, raining in cash. So that's kind of like how I started down that path. I wish it was something deeper, but that's kind of like how I got into it. Um, but very quickly, it did become very interesting. It was like, hey, how do you value companies? Like, why do they value companies that way? What kind of things can they do to, influence value, right? From like a revenue or cost perspective. And I kind of just started geeking out, like went real deep. And then it was like, okay, now how do you model the relationship of these different cost and revenue items? How
Mm-hmm.
do they flow out, right? And then, okay, now what are the Excel shortcuts? Like it just like all started like I just started geeking out in a way I didn't before. And honestly, even though I transitioned my career now to product, that like backbone has been like I would say one of the things that's really helped me in my career. Like everywhere I go, that's still like the superpower that like all the I guess leaders of the company say, "Oh wow, you really understand our business. You can tie like features to how to inflect like what can move our business and what to build and how to prioritize them and like show us actual value." Wow, that's like unheard of. But it's not really that product related, right? But it came from a skill that was in the past life. So very long-winded way of saying like it wasn't that sophisticated of a decision, but I just landed on something that was complex and that was like very interesting to me.
Mhm.
And it really has like served me ever since.
Gotcha. Right on. That's awesome. And kind of tying back to, Glenn, one of Glenn's questions is, I think at some point it inspired you to find this finance and investment club. Like, what did this club do? Just out of curiosity, and like,
Yeah.
what were some of the things that I guess motivated you to? I mean, obviously it was your interest in finance that motivated you to start it. But what was your vision there, and what did you guys do?
Yeah, man. Dude, that was one of the most fun experiences I've ever had. So I want to get into banking. UC Davis is what they call non-target school, right? They only recruited from like Ivies and then some select few schools that are very strong in like economic programs. Like Cal was one of them, right? Like even UCLA was like fringe. It was like what they call a regional target. So only like LA, SoCal based M&A shops would really recruit from there. They wouldn't really get consideration from like New York or what. It was like there's a very like regimented, well-defined kind of like pipe. Anyway, so coming from a non-target school, and after wasting a year doing like pre-med stuff, not wasting, but like doing something completely different, I'm like, shoot, how am I going to get in, right? How am I going to get in? So there were the same requirements were true. You had to have at least a 3.7 to even like get through the door. You had to have rack up good internships, and then try to have some good extracurriculars. I'm like, okay. At the time, I thought, hey, should I go to Cal, like transfer to Berkeley, which has a very well like established program, or should I stick around in Davis? Where my wife now, high school sweethearts, we both went to Davis, right? And I'm like, I like her enough to like just be serious about sticking around. And then I thought, hey, why not be a big fish in a small pond? That's not so bad. And what can I do? Dude, they have no clubs. Okay, why don't I do that? Right? I'll just copy stuff that's been done in like Georgia Tech. Like there's a lot of schools with very prominent like investment clubs. So I'm like, why don't I just copy what they're doing? Um, it's so funny, man. Like to start a club, you have to prove to the school that there's interest. So you have to like go and pitch. Like I remember I got Papa John's to give us like 10 free pizzas. And then I
What?
pulled I'm like, hey, let's give a class. Let's give like a talk. And I just pulled all my friends and got like 100 people to show up. They took the pizza, half of them left, half of them stayed. And I'm like, hey guys, like there's clearly interest there. And kind of like that's how we went. But it was so cool because I made the process very rigorous to get in. You have to like write an application and then pitch a stock. Why should we buy it?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the basis of getting in. And then once you get in, we put you into investment teams. So there's usually about like 15, 20 people. We put you in groups of 5 and you construct a portfolio, and we go into a portfolio challenge every month, or that's evaluated on a quarterly basis. And then we pick one stock and we pitch it to the group overall, and you present with your group. But what we found was like, dude, I got like all the smartest freaking students in the school into that club.
Nice. Look at
Like there
that.
was nothing there, right? So now I'm like, I was so proud of like the first court. Like we had like 6 or 7 cohorts. Like everyone was killing it. I mean, we graduated around the recession, the Great Recession. Everyone ended up killing it.
Nice.
It was just like an awesome network. Yeah, that was one of the best stories. Like I don't know, I look back at it very fondly, very very fondly.
Very cool. Very cool. And did you guys like make actual investments in this club and get wealthy all together?
Not really. No. But there was a few good calls that we made, like when we were pitching, and we would go and put in like $100 or something. We made a few $100, but yeah, overall it wasn't. I think we all viewed it as more of like a
A learning
career
experience.
enhancing type move. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah. My professor used to say, if he invested in Bitcoin when he first heard about it, he wouldn't be a professor. Yeah.
though. Man, that's another good topic too. Okay, interesting.
Anywho, so
That's super awesome.
yeah. So sorry, Glenn, did you have any other questions there?
So I mean, yeah, like right after school, you went to Tokyo to do something unrelated to finance, like data mining and machine learning. Like, how did that transition from finance go to another country and do that?
Yeah, that's a very I really interesting stories of like around my junior year, like end of your junior year. That's when you need to basically lock in your full-time offer, right? Like right when school starts into your senior year, that's usually, at least in the finance side, like that's when you want to lock things in. And I remember that was when '08, like things started crashing down. Um, but there was some really fond memories there too, because no one came to Davis. I would like back in the day in Facebook, people would like just way overshare their information of like where they work, where they like who they are, right? I would literally just spam people who I knew got in a few years like into banking, right? And I'm like, hey, can we like chat or like, hey, can I pass my resume to you? Like I literally sent out hundreds of those. And then I also found out like, hey, when are the different companies visiting the different schools like Stanford and Berkeley? And I'm just gonna sneak in. I'll say I forgot my ID card. Um, and actually the Berkeley one was so funny because you walk in the like one of the hospitals of school, everyone's like just like nervous. There's a lot of like anxiety, but it's like a big event, right? Like Credit Suisse and Goldman would bring like 70 people to these events. So I walk in there and I'm like, hey, what's, like, okay, like check in. I'm like, oh, I forgot. But you just have to like walk in with a little bit of swagger, right? You have to like act like you kind of know people around you. But once the people in there from the firms found out that I was sneaking in, oh man, like it turned into a frat party. Like they would literally be like, yo, this guy, man, he's like crashing the party. Hey, MD, like you gotta meet this guy. He's a stud, right? So I actually made the rounds with like I met everybody. Um, but unfortunately, I wish I had a good end to the story. Like a lot of these shops actually like the regional offices closed down like Citibank in San Francisco. They're like, one thing that's great about Citi is our long history will never go down. Like we're just solid. And that office shut down. It's still not back in like the last 13 years. But like the '08 crisis was just really, really bad. And I ended up, long story short again, and I ended up with two offers because I snuck into a Stanford event. I met someone from Tokyo who was trying to recruit like an analyst or associate to help start like an M&A arm that went into China in Japan. So we got to talking. I had done some internships, and he's like, "Oh, you speak Chinese? You seem like a smart enough guy. Okay, we'll give you a shot." I was choosing between that and like the little boutique M&A mergers and acquisitions M&A shop in Palo Alto. And I remember my wife's like, "Let's just do something fun, whatever, right? Like let's do the thing in Japan and see what happens." I get
Oh,
there.
so she also went to
She
Japan
also
with you.
she
Oh,
also
wow.
my visa gets delayed because they're like, hey, why are you guys hiring like this random college grad to do this when we have so much in-country talent? So it actually took me a while to get my visa. It took me like a few months. And at the time, there was another guy that recruited over, and he's like, things aren't looking great. Like, you should think about an exit strategy. Like, things are not doing well here. So, like, I cranked out my GMAT. I'm like, okay, let's have an exit plan in mind. And then I went. And as soon as I got there, like, the guy who recruited me got fired.
Mm.
Um, so it got into a situation where I'm like, okay, well, I'm here. What am I supposed to do? But the founder was like so they sold basically like machine learning models to help with price. Like it was basically like a pricing algorithm that they sold to the different companies to tell them like, hey, when should we issue discounts? What should our pricing strategy be? um so the founder there was some like ex-US investor, loved Americans, and he saw me as like maybe a younger himself. He's like, oh wow, this guy, like he comes in here, he talks a lot, like Asian American. We actually have a deal that we could use his help. So they had a big client. It was McDonald's Japan. And McDonald's Japan is a big, big business, but they operate like by country. So here it was like, hey, we're building an algorithm to help them figure out when to offer seasonal products, when to do pricing, coupons, all of that. And they're like, hey, we're training a model to pitch these guys. The CFO is Canadian and he needs everything in English. Can you help? And I'm like, okay. So that was kind of the how I got in. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah, this was your first job out of college, right? I can imagine.
Exactly. And
That's
went
just,
into a traditional Japanese company. Like
Yeah.
as the biggest guy, there's no training program, right? Like there's no nothing. Like I literally just went in there and like here's a book on SQL. You can at least like help us create some charts and Tableau. That was how it started for like 2 months. And then it became like help us translate our presentation for the CFO and you help judge our dry runs. So it was a fun time, but I knew, it wasn't going to be a long run.
how did you enjoy your time living in Japan? Kind of a side tangent. Japan's one of my favorite countries to visit, just like from the food to the tourist attractions. Yeah, I personally love Japan.
Dude, I loved it too. It's interesting because we were really poor, right? Like don't think that I was getting paid a lot. I was not. I was pretty much getting, I don't know, equivalent of like $40,000, maybe around there, right? To live in central Tokyo, that's not much.
Mm.
And,
Mm.
my wife and I both were, well, girlfriend at the time, we were both there. Um, but I'm so glad we did it young. Like now, if you ask me to do that, impossible. Like we lived in that big house share, right? Like it's called a Sakura house where there's a lot of different foreigners and there's a big house and you get your own room. There's like you kind of a dedicated bathroom to you. So you get to meet like it's kind of like you get to meet a bunch of different people from
Mhm.
different countries. Really cool. Like at night, like people usually were English teachers and then they work in karaoke bars. So like after at night, you could just go and like hang out, right? Really cool experience. We're just like always eating out in the grocery stores. At night, they would sell sushi or like tempura for like super cheap. And just an awesome experience that I don't think I'll ever get again. Um, I would say Japan is kind of like I would say the France of Asia. Like we weren't even aware of like the different Chinese dialects or languages. Like what's Cantonese? Well, what do people speak in China? Or like, oh, like they just were oblivious to all of that. Like the only other culture they really paid attention to, I would say, were like Germany, and
Mm.
US and Australia because it's kind of close by. But like in terms of just other Asian countries, they're just like, oh. Right. It was so interesting. But overall, loved it. I think we also got special treatment because like we're Western, right? Um, Overall, loved it. Definitely some intricacies of that, like that culture.
Yeah, yeah. And
Very cool.
if I'm not mistaken, they have the Japanese. There's a specific language for work called Keigo, and like it's like a different kind of. They speak it. They literally speak a different language. Like for work, like there's different honorifics. Just
Mm.
like I like navigating that as an English speaker. I imagine was challenging, right? Like, did your manager like speak good English? Like, what was that like?
Dude, yeah, that's it. There were three instances where like this was really funny. One is like they're really into one, like projecting a certain way of how you're dressed, like what you're carrying. So for example, you should always have a briefcase. You should always also have, business cards in hand and, you kind of like at meetings, you would hand them out, receive them with two hands, place them in front of you. I definitely broke some of those rules. So we went to a McDonald's like board meeting. We got to meet with the board, and I didn't have a projector, but I didn't have a bag, right? And I was like taking photos. We're in like central Shinjuku, right? I'm like, oh man, like look where I am. And I didn't even have a bag with me. So the guy was like, take our projector bag and just hold that. we go upstairs and we start exchanging cards. And I'm like, oh crap, like I didn't bring any because I didn't have a bag. And then so my coworker was like, here, just take a pile of mine and hand them out. Like it's a big deal. Um, and then also, if you ever go in the banks, they use these signature like stamps. It's like what are they called? I forget the name of it, but like it's a stamp. It represents your signature. Anytime you do anything official, you have to carry this like stamp and you just like stamp it, right? I didn't have that. So they say, okay, well, let's just sign your name. Well, anytime I need to withdraw money, they would need the literally exact same signature. So there are times when I'm like, well, he's like, this one doesn't look like that one. I'm like, okay, I kind of forgot how it looked. And they would say, okay, peep behind the counter here, take a photo of it. So like every time I'm just like drawing my signature to receive money. So there's always like there was a lot of these like little cultural moments where I'm just like looking back, really, really funny.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So how did you go from that to the next stage in your career, Zynga, portfolio management, etc.?
Yeah, so I had taken the GMAT before I left. So because I knew like good thing that person warned me about like, hey, things might not be as long term as you think. So I got into a master's program kind of like 6 months in or so. So I knew, it was gonna happen. Um, yeah, it was interesting because now I chose a school in London because it's a much more established, like pre-experienced masters in the UK. It's a much more established thing. And for the first time now I'm like in a target school. I'm getting wined and dined. I'm getting taken on tours around the trading floors. Felt great. But because I was American, I didn't speak any other European language. Um, and it was like I also couldn't get a job. I remember it was so stressful. Like coming out of graduation, I'm like, dude, I don't have anything, and I spent all this money. So again, like came back and I just started hustling. Um, took the CFA as well, at least level one at the time, to kind of make myself more marketable from a financial standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And then joined this small shop called Trigarin Capital. It was a very small private equity fund. Um, didn't really pan out. That's another thing. Like that was a hard hitting thing in my career where they were like, "Hey, we'll only give you a 3 month trial, and let's see where it goes from here. It can go up, as in we can pay you more." I remember I was getting paid bare bones, or we could let you go, right? So for 3 months, I'm just like working as hard as I can. And I thought I was doing well, but at the end of the 3 months, they actually came back and said, I don't think you're senior enough for what we're looking for. So sorry, bro. Like I still remember this. And I was like, whoa, right? For the first time, this is another one of my like hard work didn't get me the reward. Right. Um, that was hard. But the good thing that came out of it was when I started applying for jobs, no one believed me, right? Like A, that no one's heard of this fund. B, like these master's programs weren't well known in the US, nor is the CFA really that well known for like M&A type work. It's much more known in like portfolio management, asset management. But if you're doing anything in like buying and selling of companies, not that this wasn't very well known. So I had a tough time. But one of the guys who saw my resume, his mom went to Imperial. So Imperial College is super well known in the UK, and it's like very outstanding for like physics and like medical device stuff like that. And his mom was like did a PhD there, so it kind of like stuck in his mind. But when he saw my resume, then whatever, right? Like maybe pile. He meets the guys that were like firing me effectively at a networking event. And they're just like, hey, one of the, like this guy sent his resume and what's up? Like, was he just bad? But I guess at least I was a good person and I did my effort show through, right? They said, he worked hard. We just, he's not at the level that we needed him to be. Like, we needed someone who can source deals. Actually, you would be perfect for this role. Are you interested? To the hiring manager. So it convinced him, like, okay, well, let me give this guy a shot. Um, And that's kind of like what took off. Like after I got in there, like I remember like my pay basically like tripled. Like I'm into a legit shop, like legit experience. It was kind of like my big moment of like, oh my gosh, after like 3 years or 2, 3 years of grind, like angels singing, right? Like you're in. So that was kind of the long path there. We can talk about why I like eventually left, but that was a pretty big moment of like just validating that, hey, all your efforts kind of paid off.
That's awesome. No, that's super happy to hear. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
from there though, um, you didn't take your foot off the pedal. Like you were still pounding and going hard. I mean, even though this was like a huge, relief for you financially and you got to where you want in your career, you still excelled. So like, did it ever get to a point where you felt like it was easy to be complacent? And if it did, how did you overcome that?
Hmm. I don't know. Because like I think I just got into that mode where I was the underdog, right? Like wanting to
Hmm.
go into finance from a non-target school. Because finance, I mean, especially back then, like tech now has taken so much mind share of like the smartest folks out there. But back then, think back to 2008, 2009, 2010, right? Everyone was talking about finance. Like, oh, yeah, that's where the money is. It was either that or like consulting, right? Tech was, I don't even know where tech ranked unless you're like an engineer. Like, it's probably not in the top 10 in terms of where you would want to land from a job perspective. Um, so yeah, I think I just had that big underdog like chip on my shoulder where you once you get into finance, like everyone around you is from like the Ivies, like just golden paths, right? And even after I got into Zynga, like Zynga at the time, it was known as like the product manager factory. All the folks that come in there are like type A, super kind of like high achievers, right? And you're just like, oh, this is like a new playground where you're again the underdog. You don't have any like technical experience. You don't really have marketing experience, which it translates a lot to product as well. So hey, you got to grind. So it was always like that mentality of like I'm being an underdog that like kept pushing and pushing. I think StockX was the first time that it changed because they really were like really green. You know, all the people that were in StockX were kind of like coming from Quicken Loans because like that's Dan Gilbert's company, right? Outside of like two or three founders, everyone else was kind of like talent pulled from Quicken Loans, like building a mortgage servicing product. So when I got there, it became like, oh, this guy knows a lot. Like you do whatever you want. So it changed a little bit. It became more of like, oh, everything I'm launching is like getting amazing results. How can I sleep? Right? Like, let's just keep building, building, building. So the energy was a little bit different there, but early on, it was a lot of like, oh, look around you, right? You're like at the bottom. You got to survive. Therefore, you got to like just keep fighting and fighting. I think it's definitely changed a lot these days, but yeah, early on, it was a lot of that. And then it was like the energy coming from the high growth startups. I loved it, man. Like I miss my 20s and my early 30s. I think that's, yeah, it really changed the trajectory of your life when you have that type of setting, people to challenge you, like growth opportunities. I think it's great.
Right.
Did any of your other prior experiences, like going to Japan and working at Trigarian, all these other things, did they really help you when you were at StockX and Zynga?
I would say Zynga, and it just all built on itself. Like I said, like about finance, I just became pretty good, I think, of understanding how a business works. Like I'll give you a pretty easy example, right? Like how does a product make money? It needs to generate revenue. Okay, is it a unit sold times average sales price? Okay, if it's that simple, what are the different units sold? What are the different product lines? How are their price points? Okay, now when someone, and then you can just keep going from there, right? Like, hey, if someone hits your page, what's your propensity to convert on products A, B, C, D, E? How can I improve it? What have I seen historically that has improved it? And very quickly, if you can model out that relationship, I can have a pretty good understanding of where this business will land and where where it's heading, how it's done well, and where it's going to land. So at first, that was what I came in to Zynga with. Like that was like this. It didn't take long to understand that. But where Zynga really came to be really helpful was here's like 1,000 things we launched in the past, and here's how they've done. So now you start developing that like that playbook in your head. And then at StockX, it took to the next level. Not only do you have the idea, but how are you going to do it? Like this is how our tech stack looks like right now. How are you going to do it? Now I would say at this point in my career now, it's more about like taking even a step back and saying, how do I make sure my team, like what's the direction that I want the team to march towards? Whereas like StockX Zynga was much more like, how can I individually contribute as much value as possible? Now it's about like, how do you build a team that contributes value? So I think, yeah, each step has helped me kill it in the next phase. But then the next phase always requires a lot of like learning, exploration, which, is very exciting to me.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, it's like you started in the trenches and kind of understanding how the business works, and then at each level, you gain a better and more mature understanding of the business at higher and higher and higher levels. And it seems like your career trajectory is reflecting that increased knowledge. And just listening to you talk, yeah, it's I can see that like that growth in that in that knowledge and how it impacted your career. And I think that's really cool. So I guess going from these different stages in your career, between Zynga to StockX, the business itself is quite different, right? From my recollection, Zynga is like a games web-based platform, that kind of thing. StockX is more e-commerce. Do you ever see like a whiplash, like when you're going into like this very, very different environment, or for the most case, like the principles you describe pretty much applies. Like once you understand how to generate revenue after the product, you understand the product a little bit, the rest becomes like kind of natural. I'm kind of curious, where your perspectives are from that standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I struggled a lot with that early on because like even when I got into Zynga, you're working with people on the design side who's been building games for like 30 years. I remember I was working on a team where the designer sitting next to me helped build one of the first editions of Madden. And here I am, 2 months into the job, help like really pushing like, hey, we should be building this. It doesn't make sense. So it used to bother me in those types of ways. But now when I look back and it's true, right? Like being a product guy, I used to think you have to be the smartest person, set the vision, right? And a lot of that is still true, but I think it actually comes about in more ways than just like having it totally be originating from your head. Because otherwise you'll always be playing catch up. Even when I went to StockX, was I like a big sneakerhead? Not really. Do I know a lot about streetwear? No, right? Like, yeah, I can learn, but am I going to overtake someone who's been working in a sneaker store since he was 15 and now is 45, right? Like, probably not. Who's been blogging about sneaker culture? So one thing that I've come to learn is from a product standpoint, the most important thing, you're actually kind of like the general. If you think about like an army context or like a coach, the scout comes to you, right? And says, so think of it as like the design team comes to you and says, hey, I'm noticing these things. Your like corporate development team might be saying, hey, these competitors are coming up. Your engineering team is telling you, hey, these systems are brittle, we might need to improve it. Your data engineering team might be telling you like, hey, like we have other sources of data out there that we can grab and build pipelines for. And so you're kind of like collecting all of this information. And yes, you should have a good point of view on like how the business moves. But now you're kind of like collating all of this information. You're saying, based on everything I know and I've heard, this is where I think we should go after. It's based on like competitive analysis, understanding of like our tech, of our users from our user research team, right? From like data on how people are actually using it, and from like our financial goals. Bang, right? Like you're not the person who's just going to sit in the ivory tower and say, I'm going to ignore everything and just like, this is what I know and therefore this is what it is. Your job is actually talk to all the experts that are on your team and come together with a vision that's like representative of all that information. So very long-winded way of saying, yeah, like whiplash, I don't think so. It's more of like back then I very much because I'm like, oh, I feel vulnerable because I'm not like the expert anymore. But I look at it completely different now. Now it's like, hey, it's not my job to be smarter than everybody. My job is actually to be a better listener and to communicate in a way where I clearly have heard all that you've said and now in a succinct manner put out what we need to go. So yeah, I think it's just evolved a lot in my thinking. But now I actually look forward to changes because I'm like, hey, I get to learn like a whole new thing, right?
Yeah, no, right on.
Just processing that wisdom that you shared, and why would the person who is the expert with the decades of experience in that field, were they unsuccessful in being able to do that, or what kind of inhibited them from being able to also have that type of capability to just be a sponge and listen to their teams?
That's a good question. Often you actually you want them to actually do here that, right? But it's just as it's how the teams are structured today, it's not their job. Right now they are typically I'll do user research, for example, because they usually have a very good understanding of what the user is having pain points of and needs and wants. So theoretically, you could say, hey, why don't we just have this person come to us and say what they've been hearing that users are struggling with or wants, and also from like what they've seen in their surveys, and let's just use that to set the roadmap. But when you have two researchers and 10 million users, where do you even want them to focus their time? Right? Like even if they every waking minute of their day, they're spending time to talk to people or like watch people, watch sessions, they're never going to have like the comprehensive thing. But their job is actually to do that. So they're actually looking to you as a product person to say, hey, like I've noticed this type of segment, then this type of problem, our company solves this type of problem, or like, hey, this part of the world is showing a drop off in a certain conversion rate, or like, hey, we saw a huge drop off in this. Can you pinpoint what's going on for like that set? So they have a very different job, I would say, than to be very, very big picture. They are like the experts that come in with that information. Just like I see a lot of data analysts also struggle. You could say, hey, data analysts, why aren't you like going out there and exploring all these different data insights and then bubble them up so then we can use that? Well, there's a million ways you can cut it, right? And unless you really understand like all the information around you, like where are we launching new features? What have we launched recently? How has pricing? Like, unless you have all of this like context, it's actually very hard for them to just go like, oh, go poke around, right? So I think I actually, when I say general, it's like there's a give and there's a receive. You have to give information on how they can best perform their job to add value to what you're looking for. And at the same time, when they present it back, you have to receive it well and to consolidate that finding. So I would say it's not like they can't, but it's not part of their day to day. I would say they're packed with like just trying to do their part of the job.
I see.
Like solving sometimes, I mean, the technical folks may not be the most business minded too. So I think that's another skill set entirely, like you mentioned. solving the technical problems, or kind of understanding how the market is shifting and this and that, and what the consumers need. That is like in and of itself kind of its own responsibility. And I think from what I've seen generally, they are separate roles. And I guess maybe this would help add some insight as well. But can you describe what your current role is and what you currently do?
Yeah, so I just joined. It's kind of crazy because we were about to have a baby, but I literally, like a month before my wife's due date, joined a new startup. I think we're at 16 people, so very early seed stage startup called Practice. We're building a platform that helps the solo entrepreneur. So you can think of, your therapist, your career coach, your life coach, right? When they're working with a client, they're actually today using a bunch of different tools. How do you schedule someone for the appointments? How do you keep their notes? How do you bill them for what they're doing? How do you keep the contract that they sign, right? Like in a safe place. Usually they use we use Google Docs, and then I use Excel to track how they're doing, and then I just bill them through Stripe. It's a very big workflow that they have to manage. So, as a platform, we're trying to consolidate everything into one and make it much more seamless. So it's a pretty cool problem set. I joined as their head of product. They're actually growing quite well. I think the one thing that they needed help with, or what drove the need, is around help to set that vision, right? Because it's a little bit different with SaaS. With consumer products, typically you don't really hear what people want. Typically they'll just say oh, I wish this was cheaper, or hey, how come customer service isn't picking up, or hey, where's my package? Those are your general feedback. But in a SaaS business, typically you'll get very detailed descriptions of, here's what I want, here's what you're missing. But how do you take hundreds of pieces of feedback and build it into a business, right? It's very hard. You can work on all of these things, but we probably have 10 years worth of stuff on the roadmap or on the backlog. But what's your framework for deciding what to work on and when, and what is defining success? So I think that's where I'm helping them do, is help them frame up where do you want to place your bets so that we can reach certain milestones.
Mm-hmm. Right on. And also kind of making sure that those are good bets, right? Mm-hmm. That those are wise bets based on your own analysis and all that, like you said. Wow, sounds like a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, man. My wife's like, "What are you doing?" But hey, if this is what you want, I'll get behind it.
I guess I have a general question about you. Of course, it seems like you have a lot of experiences. Would you say Zynga was the biggest company you worked for, and then the other experiences have all been kind of startups?
So it depends. I would say, from how I would view a company's maturity level, yes. Surprisingly, because Zynga wasn't that mature. But because StockX eventually, we got to over 2,000 employees. So I think from a size-wise, it surpassed Zynga, but it's still very early days at StockX in terms of just infrastructure. So I would say Zynga was the most established place. Yeah.
Gotcha. And just kind of comparing your experiences at a more established company versus a more a startup, smaller company, what was your general perspectives, and what were some of the challenges with either or, I suppose?
Yeah. I mean, I think I give this advice a lot for folks who are just entering into their first job or second job. Typically, I would say pick the more established companies, especially if they have a good reputation around developing the skills or around the function that you're going for. So for example, like at Zynga, they had a central product team who was core job was to make sure, because if you think about Zynga, there was like 10 games and each one was like a small company. And then you have like central services that supported all of these different games. But each game is like its own company. Um, but you would be surprised they don't talk to each other. It's like, hey, this one team who's doing like a slots game and another team who's doing like a poker game, probably a very similar audience that's playing both.
Mm-hmm.
So shouldn't they want to know stuff that you're testing and what works and vice versa, right? So they very early on, very wisely so, they created a central product team. It was actually seen as like when a PM burns out, they would take a break and go to central product because it's a little bit more relaxed. But their job is to make sure information gets shipped. And also like any new themes that come out, they jump on it right away. Like I really miss those days of just sitting in a theater and there's like a PM that presents to me, hey, this is WeChat, the super app. I mean, this is like 2013. Here's all the features. We did a big deconstruct. Here's like how the growth curve looked when the features launched. And I'm just like, so you always like know what's happening. I missed that a lot. I think anyone early on, it can give you a ton of context. There's a million specs that you can like go back and look at, a million features. They teach you how to write SQL. They teach you everything, right? If you don't have that foundation going to a startup, it's tough. It's very tough for you to level up. Even if you get hired as like, I don't know, engineer number 5 or something like that, if you came in with as a pretty junior guy, it's going to be very hard for you to pick up the skills that they'll need, 2 years down the road if the growth does happen. Mm-hmm. You would much rather be employee 5 after having a good breadth of experience under you. Otherwise, it's actually very hard for you to grow. So I think I got lucky in that sense where by the time I got to startups, I already had a decent foundation. But even I struggled at times, right? Because now I don't have an engineer, I don't have a project manager, I didn't have anyone. You get in there, it's like, hey, you sit with these 5 devs and you push stuff out. I'm like, okay. Right. So I think I usually would recommend like, yeah, unless you're super passionate about a certain area, like better to learn in a bigger company.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Have you guys found that similar experiences or no?
I guess I can go first. I started my career interning as you do, like as an engineer. It's very highly encouraged when you're in school to go do internships and here and there. And I did a handful of internships, not with really big companies, with actually startups. And then a lot of engineering internships at the undergrad level are actually unpaid, but that's a whole nother thing. But I was fortunately enough to find me an internship that paid me minimum wage.
Nice.
So it may have been a little less than minimum wage at the time. Anyways, and then yeah, so my career, I actually kind of almost went the reverse. I started off small and then gradually made my way to larger and larger companies. And at the smallest company, kind of reflecting back, I personally think I learned the most in that environment.
Interesting.
It was extremely fast paced. It was like a 10 or so person company that came together to build race cars. And I wore a lot of hats, from like designing the parts to manufacturing the parts, speccing them out to suppliers, whatever. And I hopped from that, and I don't know, again, I'm not sure if this is a common experience with engineering, but I hopped from that to a better opportunity, a little bit bigger company. That was my first full-time job, which was actually in product management. And that's where I learned things like agile, Scrum, all those buzzwords, sprint planning, kind of learning the software culture. And then from there, I personally felt like I hit a ceiling because everybody above me either had higher degrees or have been with the company for like 20, 30 years. And so I made the hard decision to go back to school. And it was a tough decision because I was already out of school for like 4 or 5 years. Like I couldn't remember how to do basic math. And so kind of getting back on that train was really tough. But anyways, the short version is so right now, the company that I'm at is probably the biggest company that I've worked for. And kind of reflecting back on the journey, um, it's different. It's different. I feel like the things I miss about working at a startup was sort of the close knitness, the how it was definitely stressful. That I don't miss. I think things at a larger company, at least from my own personal experience, it's a little slower. It's a little slower, and and right now I am absorbing a lot from my environment, from that standpoint. But I feel like at a larger company, it's also easy for you to uh, get focused in to make a really small contribution in one very specific area. I guess as an engineer at least. I think if you're in a different role, it may not be the case, but yeah. So for me, I felt like learn the most in a startup environment. The larger company is more kind of a stable a lifestyle where what you're working on is a little bit more focused. There's less ambiguity. But yeah, how about you, Glenn?
I mean, I think I don't have as much work experience as either of you, but similar sentiment to Chris in that having worked at a startup in my last job right out of graduate school, I thought it was a really good opportunity to, it's like sink or swim, right? You have to wear many hats, and sometimes you're giving a problem you have no experience solving, and you don't have the foundation necessarily, but there might be people that can help you, and if you can figure it out yourself, that's even better. But oftentimes there might not be somebody who can help you, and you just have to find your own way, like hustle, right? um, and that would require a lot of independent learning, putting extra hours. But I think it creates that environment for you to have to find a way forward regardless, because somebody else is going to solve it for you. So I think that I do a lot of credit to the startup kind of environment. Um, and now that I'm working at my current company, which is also like several orders of magnitude larger than my last job, I do feel like it seems a lot slower paced. Now, granted, the role is also different, it's more data engineering focused rather than product engineering. It feel like I don't get to branch out a lot, and I don't see the whole picture. Whereas at the startup, because I was so focused on multiple aspects and then trying to connect with other teams on putting like one, it was all focused on one product. So we had to kind of get multiple resources from different departments to kind of come together when like one delivery was to be made. You got to see some overlap in how other teams are working together with you, and how you can feed information to them to help them, and they have to feed information back to you. So you can see a little bit broader scopes
Mm.
of what the whole business is. And now at my current company, I feel even though I'm working on certain things that touch a lot of areas, I feel like some people in the public might even know more about the company than I do. Like there's kind of curtains over my limitations in day to day to like what's relevant to what I need to get done for the day. So I don't branch
You're
out
also
enough.
a public company, right? Well,
Yes,
yeah,
public company. Yeah.
I think that's right. Like when you're a startup, information's pretty transparent. Like I remember even at StockX, like even the person working in the warehouse can see how many transactions we're doing a day. And as we're getting closer and closer to like IPO, it was like, okay, no, access management is a big deal, right? Like, so I can definitely see how that's totally true, right? And it's just so information is much harder to get.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but I think one of the things that still kind of differentiates our different work experience is to go from the individual contributor to the leadership role. I mean, that's a completely different set of skills. And how do you go from one to another? A lot of people never can make that leap if they want to. And a lot of people just don't even want to go in that route. So like, how did you even make that journey? And like, where did you have to grow in certain areas to get to that level to be a better leader?
Yeah, I think, and I mean, it's a work in progress, right? But there's the concept of, I would say, managing up and down, which I think a lot of people don't think about. Because I mean, after every review cycle, I always get hit up by people saying, "Oh, I can't believe I didn't get this," or like, "I can't believe this person got that, and here I am where I am." Right? There's a lot of typically those type of sentiments, or like, "Hey, during layoffs," which we've all seen, "I can't believe I was laid off. I didn't see this coming. How can they let do this to me?" Right? Like, I think for me, it was more understanding, okay, well, in order to get the opportunity to lead, there's really only a few opportunities, a few ways to get there. One is you have been in a company long enough where you have a clear expertise over something. And therefore it scales so much that they're like, hey, we need to build after, for this person, we need to build a team for this person because his or her role has grown so much. Two is, hey, you actually have managed people in the past, and now another team is looking to bring someone in to manage a very similar team. So I would say if that's the case, typically you would need to go path one, because in order to get to path two, you kind of need path one. So typically I like to be like, what has worked for me is become really, really good at what you are doing. And then make sure what you're doing is communicated well to your manager. And one thing I was reporting up to the COO and then eventually the CMO. And I realized I don't think she has any idea what I'm doing. Like, she was very focused on like the brand side. By the time I left, I was controlling everything from like clickstream data to like conversion rate optimization to like promotions, like how do you do promos. That's like a lot of different, and like marketing attribution. Like, for every dollar spent, should it be attributed to this one investment we made or this other one, right? How do we do it? How do we model it out? For her, she's like, I just know Charles does like a lot of these things, but she has no idea what I'm doing. But because I'm like, I'm sure she wants to know. So what did I do, right? I started saying, why don't I start summarizing the key highlights of what I'm doing to her on a weekly or even daily, whatever frequency it makes sense to you. For me, I said on a weekly basis, because actually it would make her feel very smart, because these questions get asked all the time by the CEO anyways, because usually they get routed to me. By making her look smart and also keeping her up to date on what I'm doing, that can only help our relationship, right? So I think as you and whoever else is listening to this, like, think about your boss is just like a human, right? How do you build that relationship with your boss so that you will get the opportunity to say, hey, when the opportunity comes, hey, I think this person can lead because I already have that trust built in. So I guess it's really a long-winded way of saying two things. One is become good at what you're doing, and two, manage up effectively. And when the opportunity comes, you will now be very much in line for the opportunity to become a leader. If you become good at doing something, but no one knows, then it's like the forest falling in a tree situation. You'll get surprised by sudden layoffs and you're gone. You'll get surprised by why you keep getting passed over, and resentment can build. So my typical advice in terms of like how you even get that opportunity in the first place is usually be good at managing up, and then also yeah, become good at your job, which should be a given. Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, I 100% agree with that. Yeah, something that we should all abide by. Yeah, because you could be doing great work, but if nobody can back you up, it'll go unseen and unappreciated and whatnot. But yeah, no, definitely. Thank you so much for that insight. So I know we went a little bit over time, so our apologies for that. Charles, Glenn, did you have any other questions for Charles?
I'm curious. I mean, yeah, thank you for your time. Ultimately, I know we did go over time. But I guess as a last thought, like, are there any things that we didn't ask you that you feel like were pretty pivotal parts to your, career and important lessons, wisdoms that you want to impart to as like final thoughts for this episode?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this last night. So the audience I'm thinking about is like people about to enter their work or like that are early on in their careers. Um, I think the one thing I will say is, or maybe two things, nothing is that hard. I think people oftentimes they get stuck behind like, oh my gosh, like I'm 25 and but I feel like I want to get into product management or like I want to learn how to code, but I'm so behind. What can I do? Right? You would be surprised at how quickly you'll catch up if you're truly obsessed with something. So my advice often is don't get caught up by like being late, but don't wait because that'll even make you even more late. Nothing is as hard as you think. Just go after it with energy, and you'll be good. I think the second thing is around like just this ownership mindset of, if things don't happen for you, own it, right? Just be very honest with yourself on like, hey, why didn't I get this job? Why didn't I get this promotion? Maybe something bad did happen to you. Maybe someone was mistreating you, but did you do everything you can to impact that outcome? I think if you're able to look yourself like very just, honestly and own that outcome, you'll also be fine. So these are like reminders that I tell myself all the time. It's like own what you can, and yeah, and nothing is that hard. You'll figure it out. So I think those would be my two phrases to leave behind.
Right on.
Very great. Thank you so much.
All right,
Thank you so
gentlemen.
much. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Charles. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I personally learned a lot. Hopefully, our viewers can learn a lot as well. And yeah, thank you again for your time.